Yeah. Those chunks of floaters. They flags out there.
What's up?
And went out to go the motor just took that out. Catch a fish or just out tomorrow?
Well, that's what I know.
Like fertilizer or something. Yeah. Really. Yeah, yeah. It bears out. Bears. Presentation.
The rest of it.
Bush beer one day chasing the army first. We're still Newburgh Village and Brink. It was on the second story at home, trying to get the gas door up there. Next morning, guys, towards Wallace Hill, that direction. You don't follow that way, you go around. It's still that direction. Yeah, well, we're police supported other people. So the non-politics is not going to be that's like
And Rob Mullins. Yeah, we're missing, we're just missing two, Mark. I think. Well, the agenda's right there. Okay. I think I made copies too. Oh, here they come. Yeah, that's it. But do you want to do it intro first? Okay. Hey, guys, how are you? Take a seat anywhere. How are you? No, there's one right there. Or there, or there. Take your choice. And maybe just, I'll give you guys, anybody, the markers go.
What are your calculations?
Yeah. Just fill out your name tag if you would. Thank you. Right. Okay. Well, you can, oh, you can. You're ready. You wanna. Yeah. That's what I didn't have to figure. Yeah, they can just this field. Oh, here's down there. The strata.
Like for this, I'm appreciating the Northeast Kingdom, and then. That last about 2 weeks. Probably relative first number. We don't get up. We get a buzz, we get a buzz. Not nearly as bad for our. Those cool streams. That's a big, 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 Oh, they probably called the.
It's indicative of Okay, I think we'll start, because I think everybody coming is here, except we have one person coming late. So Mark, we'll just have to do a little introduction.
Well, it's going to be brief, but welcome everybody. Thanks for giving up your evening here to be with us and agreeing to give up many more. For those folks who I haven't got the pleasure of meeting, my name is Mark Scott. I'm the Director of Wildlife for the department, and I've had the pleasure of working for the department for a long time. And I sincerely feel grateful for that. One thing I have learned over all these years is people are passionate about wildlife. Whether we want to see a bald eagle fly by or have the opportunity to shoot a white-tailed deer or a turkey. This subject here that you're working on is one that's quite significant to our Fish and Wildlife Department. Trapping is one of the key wildlife management tools in our box. And we appreciate you folks coming together to help us work on best management practices for them. The department put a lot of thought and time into trying to get you to come and represent your interests of the organization at this meeting. The history on it, we went before the regulatory board that deals with most of the regulations that deal with hunting and trapping and fishing, that they are empowered to do so by legislature. And they we asked for their endorsement of this process, and they did. This is solely working on the best management practices. There's other issues that deal with trapping that the department staff will have to take up with the board at future meetings to do that. So on behalf of the department, thank you so much. Our commissioner couldn't be here tonight, or else he could stand in here. I'm too welcome. But the wildlife division is going to take the lead for the commissioner in trying to do the best we can to see this effort. And to lead us, we asked Kim Royer, who I'm hoping everybody knows in this room. She's been our face for further management for a long time in the state of Vermont. She's held lots of different hats in the department. I first got to meet Kim in the field down in Springfield when I was hired as a seasonal by the late Bill Slack. One of our wildlife management areas is named after up in Norton there. Kim was initially hired as a habitat biologist for us. She recently retired, but I said, well, wait a minute. When we realized this fight was coming down, this challenge for the department, we felt we had to reach out to somebody who had the best talents and knowledge about this area. Kim graciously agreed. Come on retirement. I think that would be an easy task. If you run a private business, you pick up the phone and say, can you come on over and work for us for a couple of months, and this is what we'll pay you. Well, I think it took me 4 months to get through the state of Vermont paperwork. We are a bureaucracy, and I learned way back. Some things are good about having a bureaucracy. There's other things that just, you gotta have a lot of patience. It takes time. But Kim's role will be chairing this working group, and I want to stress this is a working group amongst you. I'm not going to be a working group member or participant. I'll do whatever I can behind the scenes to help Kim. We've got different department people, staff that's going to be helpful at different times throughout this. The one participant beyond Kim chairing this group is Lieutenant Game Warden Sean Fowler, who is a participant on this committee. And tonight, a different warden, because we're doing the breakout groups.
Yeah.
But you better vote what your boss says. No, there's not going to be any vote. So we're going to talk about that. So it gives me great pleasure to turn this meeting over to Kim and let you know that if any of you need anything or got questions or concerns, please reach out to any of us. I prefer maybe direct communications to me or Kim, and then we can make sure everybody's on the same page on communications. But thank you so much, Kim. How's retirement been?
It's been great. Thank you very much. Yeah.
But
No.
I know we're indebted to have you come back and work through this effort. And I can't say when your employment's up, because I'm not sure how long this whole process is gonna take.
Well, I've been outside every day, which has been nice to get out from behind the computer. So that's been great.
Good for
Um,
you. Well, that was
yeah.
a question I got asked at the 100th day when I was gonna retire. And suppose they actually asked me how old I am, and I said, I'm thinking about it because of that reason right there.
Yeah.
I want to be outside a bit more.
Yeah.
You only have so many years on planet here. Someday you've got to recognize that maybe it's time to do what you're doing, and other few people in this room I know too have gone down that route. So we all have to face it one time or another. But thanks, Kim.
So Mark, maybe we'll start out since you sort of introduced yourself.
Yeah.
I was going to have go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves, maybe talk about who they represent and maybe a little of their background. But the one question we were going to ask was, what was your first job? Not necessarily in wildlife, but
Awesome.
right out of high school. So what was your first job?
Okay, mine, I think babysitting
Oh, really?
in high school. Yeah, but I loved it because at that time, believe it or not, I used to run an awful lot. And Kevin Lawrence probably knows our family history on competitive racing, but I had these two boys I'd watch and I loved it because, so I used to run, be able to run every day. They go on their bicycles. And I got my workouts in that way and got paid. I think I got $1 an hour, I believe. And wow, that was big money to me. I won't say when, to do that.
Yeah.
But I will announce too, Senator Chris Bray is going to be on this committee as well. And he texted me, got into some traffic delays, so but he's going to be here, so I'm so happy to do that. And also on the House Fish and Wildlife and Natural Resource Committee, Amy Sheldon, she could not be here tonight due to an unforeseen situation. Everything's good, it's fine, but she is going to represent the House side on the Committee of Jurisdiction. So we kind of say committees of jurisdiction, the House and the Senate that we deal with, those are two committees that preside to somewhat on all the rulemaking we do. They have a lot of play. Legislature actually goes back and asks them, we follow the intent of the law when we do a rule that. So sorry, I
Okay, no,
forgot that part.
that's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
So maybe, I think we'll start with introductions and then we can sort of get into the meat of the working group effort. So Kevin, maybe you want to just quickly, a little bit of your background and
Sure.
your first job.
Well, it's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So I'm Kevin Lawrence, I'm from Newbury, Vermont, currently been there for 20 years, my wife, we have a farm there. But I'm a school teacher by trade and hunter fisher trapper by passion. A master's in natural resource management, that kind of thing. And what else? I work with the Vermont Trappers Association as a representative today. And my first job was picking blackberries, where I got 25 cents a gallon. My mom was my boss, and I was eager.
Yeah. So yeah, that sounds like a pretty nice first job.
Always huge.
Yeah. Mike.
My name is Mike Scott, Bradford District Game Board. I participate in all things that come with being a game board. Here purely as somebody who has the experience in the field regulation. First job as a kid, about $5 an hour. I worked hoeing rows in the vegetable farm.
Bruce Barner, representative of the Vermont Trappers Association. I'm a civil engineer by trade. My first job was actually working for the state parks at Little River and Waterbury State Park. Waterbury,
And you're with the Vermont Trappers Association.
I live in Vermont Trappers Association.
Thank you. We'll do staff after, why don't we just keep going around the table?
Okay, my name is Michael Coles from Highland Pond. On the Fish and Wildlife Board for Essex County. Came from a non-hunting background, started until my 20s with patient mentors in place. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about this. My first job when I left high school, I left Connecticut, moved to New York City, and was a chef.
Mark Van I'm on also on the Wildlife Board, I represent Rutland County and the state. I've been in the sporting goods business 43 years. I'm also a hunter ed instructor for archery and firearms. My first job was logging grandfather. That's what I did there. I didn't do a lot, but I did, help them all over there. It was all Paul Boyd, loaded in my hand. Package truck. Wait, was also added 100 Fisher. Not tracked as much as I have, but that's what I love.
My name is Scott Chapman. I'm with the Vermont Federation of Sportsmen's Club. I'm here tonight. Standing Chris Bradley, who's out of town and couldn't make it. My present occupation is process engineer for the nutritional supplement product line for people with pets, mostly for pets. I hunt, I fish. I'm a competitive shooter. I do not trap, although I have a lot of friends that do. My first job out of high school was a cavalry scout in the United States Army.
Thank you for filling in tonight, Scott. Appreciate it. Rob,
Rob Mullen, I'm with the Vermont Wildlife Coalition. I grew up here in Farragut, Florida. Started at age 10. And I'm like Mark, I will admit with 1965. And I spent 20 years in New York City and Southern California, though. So I got back to Vermont in 2006. I came back voluntarily. And basically, my first job was timber stand cuts for the USDA property control. Wildlife parks, that's what I do.
thank you, Rob.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joanne Borbo. I'm the Northeastern Regional Director for the Humane Society of the United States. I've been with HSUS for about 27 years, and I work in the State Affairs Department, where we oversee the policies that we work on in the Northeast, including here in Vermont. My first job was working at a hospital pharmacy. Learned how to make my way to the city of Manchester by delivering prescriptions across the the city. So that was interesting.
In Manchester?
In high school, Manchester, New Hampshire.
Hampshire, yeah.
Where I'm from.
Thank you. Brenna,
So I'm Brenda Galdenzi, and I'm the president and co-founder of Protector Wildlife. Vermont from Connecticut, lived in Florida, moved to Vermont from Florida in 2010. My first job was mucking out horse stalls.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Decker. I'm a certified wildlife biologist. I'm here to represent the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Partly because my engagement with issues of best management practices, that was first a concept before there were BMPs and then through the development. I've been a biologist for 34 years for state and federal fish and wildlife agencies. I live in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. Here's a representing AFWA here. First job, I guess I grew up in an agricultural setting. We didn't get paid for the work we did on farms. The first paying job was as a waiter in a Jesuit monastery.
some interesting background. Sean, beat that one.
I have the answers myself.
Sean Fowler, I'm the Northeastern Supervisor for the Warden Service, been a warden for 21 years. I grew up in Plainfield, Vermont, where I live on Fowler Road in my great grandparents' house. And I can also answer that my first paying job was right out of high school going into the US Army.
So Chris, do you want to?
Chris Saunders, I'm a project coordinator with the department. I've been here 20 years now. I live in Calais. I do a lot of work with the Wildlife Division and the Commissioner's Office, specifically looking at our licensing and also human dimensions, which is how people relate to wildlife. My first job was on a road crew in the Adirondacks at the summer job, and we actually mowed east down on the ski slope. And within a week, the supervisor had run over my foot, so my first workman's comp wasn't here.
That Ruth?
After guessing, I'm a lawyer for the department. And I grew up in the Virgin Islands. I did a lot of babysitting, but I considered my first job to be office work in water.
I find that hard to believe. Dr. Cottrell.
I'm Walt Cottrell. I'm a veterinarian. Before that, I was a wildlife biologist back here in this department and practiced domestic animal medicine for a long time, and then became a wildlife veterinarian. That's lasted for the last 16 years. And recently was on contract with wildlife division here. However, that now has ended, and I've retired also. My first job was washing pots and pans for 85 cents an hour. But that was 19. 16.
Chris.
I'm Chris Bernie. I'm a wildlife biologist, Department of Fish and Wildlife. I work out of the Springfield office. Mayor, going through, but took Vermont to be my own in 1994. Moved out here for this position. And I've worked on the fur bearer project since I've started, including the best management practices project. So I did a lot of lawn mowing and firewood stacking. My first real job actually was with the Maine Department of Fish and Wildlife at junior high school, where I worked with district biologists and wood duck foxes and help solve people problems.
Comes around, goes around. Chris.
Yep.
Yeah. And my name is Kim Royer, and Mark gave you most of my background. I started with the department in '81 as a habitat biologist, and I've been the fur bearer biologist and deputy commissioner, and back to fur bearer biologist again, and now retired, which is not as bad a gig as I thought it might be. So I hope you enjoy it, Walt. And my first job was actually, well, I had two sort of in the same summer, because I quit the first job after about 4 weeks. I was sewing sleeves in a coat factory, and I really was very bad at it. And and everybody around me spoke Portuguese, and they finally said, "Little girl, I don't think you really belong here." So I moved on and taught horseback riding in camp. Anyway, so thank you all. As Mark said, I know most of you are volunteering your time for this. We really appreciate you putting the effort into this. I think it's going to be a challenging thing to pull off, given the fact that no other state in the country has tried to take what was intended to be recommendations and create rules out of them. So we don't really have anything to follow in this case. And obviously, there's people with very strong values and opinions in this room on both sides. And so we know that it's going to be a challenge to try to find consensus. But our role, and that the people in the back of the room and mine, is to try to ensure that the process is fair, that we hear everybody's voice, that we're as transparent as we possibly can, and to try to get us to the point where we get some informed consent by the group on some recommendations for the commission. So that's what we're really trying to do. We sent you out the working group decision making. We're trying to get consensus, which is not like enthusiastic endorsement. It doesn't mean everybody gets their own way. It's the highest level of agreement that can be reached without dividing the participants into factions. And that's our goal as department members, is to try to see if we can move through this process and come out with something on the other end that we get some informed consent. So we're going to work towards the objectives of the working group in good faith. We'll all have an opportunity to articulate our own interests and our own values and our own concerns. Hopefully we'll be able to find some common ground. Maybe that's optimistic, but that's my hope. And then through a series of discussions and active listening, hopefully we'll come up with some recommendations over the course of the 3 meetings. So there'll be opportunities also to document our disagreements. We'll have flip charts in both of the breakout groups, and we're hoping we'll document both common ground and disagreements. Maybe some things that we'll put into a holding area where we might come back to those. So, we'll try some different strategies. Chances are we might make some mistakes through this process. And we apologize in advance for those, but we'll do the very best we can to make sure that we're, like I said, we're trying to be as fair as we possibly can. I just want everybody to keep in mind, and Mark touched on this, that there is nobody in this room, I dare say, that doesn't care deeply about wildlife and the future of wildlife populations. So let's just remember that that's some common ground for us all, is that we all have, many of us have spent decades working towards the benefit of wildlife populations. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that everybody feels that way. I think our goal, besides trying to find the consensus, is also, see, Chris, what did we do with the ground rules? Let's pass those out. Because what I wanted to try to do was go through the ground rules, and we brought the ground rules together off of different websites and came up with some suggested ground rules. But I don't think we necessarily captured them all, or even that you would all agree with the ones that we came up with. So I want to just make sure that you folks all support these ground rules, that we can all buy into the ground rules. And if you have some suggested changes, they're up here. So the first one is that we participate fully with humility and good intent. Anybody have problems with that one, or changes they'd like to make to it? Second one is accept the statutory charge of the working group and focus on the group's goals. And the statutory charge, as we read it from the legislation, is listed right here. There's 6 charges that we have to address. And we're hoping that these provide the sideboards for all of us in terms of what fits under one of these charges. So, you know, everybody will have a copy of this, and this is what we're going to try to focus on. Anybody have concerns about that, or does that make sense to people? Listen respectfully. I'm sure you'll all do that. Appreciate that all the group members are coming to the meetings with different experiences and different cultural backgrounds, and different values. We know that as well. Anybody have anything to add or change about that one? Be careful about assumptions and generalizations based only on your own experience and background. And try to put yourself in the other person's shoes if you can. Be open to hearing and learning from others, and be open to changing your perspective. Stick to one conversation and include all members in that conversation. So we will be breaking up into subgroups, but unless we're broken up into the subgroups, let's try to stay as one large group and have one conversation and not sub-conversations if we can. Understand that your word choice and tone can impact others. Differentiate between what is opinion, which everyone has, and what is informed knowledge, which comes from sustained experience, study, and practice. Anybody have concerns about that? Like I said, we're all bound to make mistakes, and we're try to admit to those, and we'll be willing to accept them, and we'll try to move forward, even though we acknowledge those. Understand that there are different approaches to solving problems, and refrain from broadcasting the comments of individual members in public communications such as emails and social media. So we have to sort of have a trust in this working group that we're here in good faith. We're going to have conversations. We're not going to send those specific conversations out to people, to the public, until we come to some kind of ending of this process. Do these make sense to people? Would anybody have suggestions for anything you want to add or change? We're happy to do that. Like I said, these come from a compilation of different things we found on different websites, but We thought it'd be easier than brainstorming for all of us. Okay. Is everybody, yeah, Kevin?
I was thinking that as a group, we had some contention in the past, and I've heard department employees get kind of lambasted, and other people as well, as board members. Maybe we can start from a position of forgiveness and just say, okay, fresh start. Let's do that.
Okay, I think does that make sense to people?
Obviously, like, you can't take back the words you've said or the things you've written, but you can decide, start from a new place.
Okay, I'm gonna actually add that one, Kevin. If everybody good with that? And I think Chris and Chris are probably taking notes, so you'll get that down, right?
Lucky 13.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody have any other ones they want to add or change? Everybody's good? All right, so we'll try to live by these if we can. We'll keep them up here so we can refer back to them. If you feel like one of the members of the group is kind of going outside what we picked for our ground rules, I think we should just sort of acknowledge that and let them know and try to bring people back into what we're trying to do here. So the agenda here is, we've already done the review. I didn't review the agenda first, but review the agenda, introductions. I'll talk about the process outline in a minute. And then we reviewed the ground rules, the decision-making process, and the committee charge, I think is limited to the legislative mandate. That's basically what's giving us our guidelines, right, Mark?
Yes, there may be some other things in it, the commissioner needs to address, but I think the real key focus is the best management practices.
Okay.
For tracking, and we do know, folks, that we have lived through those different interests that touch on that, and that'll be a subject that this group will want to talk about. Is it part of that best management practice to touch it or not?
Okay. So I just the commissioner wanted me to just kind of go over the timeline for this process, and this may be optimistic, but tonight's the first working group meeting. We'll report progress to the board on the 17th, the board meeting is August 17th. We will have a second working group meeting on August 23rd and a third working group meeting on September 8th. And these dates were basically chosen by the doodle poll that was sent out, by the dates where the most people could make these meetings. I think, maybe Rob, did you fill out?
I
did
didn't
fill out the whole
realize,
thing.
I didn't
Yeah.
know you could scroll across the different days.
Yeah, that's what I think I assumed that you guys, yeah. So I was hoping you could make those dates, so I did.
Yeah, they're fine.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the 23rd, I mean, my birthday is
We could bring it to
well, that's not my birthday. My birthday's before I gotta go to Virginia. My brother's birthday is just a couple days after. The whole thing.
Okay, you can be excused. Then we'll submit a progress report to the Fish and Wildlife Board at hopefully the September meeting, if we don't need a fourth meeting of this group. So we'll see where we are, probably in August, or at the September 8th meeting. We're gonna do a public meeting, I think in October or November, or at least one that would be in person and maybe through Zoom as well.
It would be nice to do both. But, you know, people love to team in some. So, yeah, we'll cross that bridge when it comes, and date two. We obviously want to have it so at least a couple weeks ahead, so people want to tune in with that.
Okay.
Kevin,
Or just do Zoom, but it'll be Teams, some kind of virtual.
Yeah.
Just for clarification, you say a public meeting for the Fish and Wildlife Board?
No, for the subject content. Obviously, the board members will be interested, but it will not be through the legal process of voting on certain language. So we'd just like to get more input from the public, basically share with them work that you folks have produced and try to see if there's anything missing out there or not. And come back, we may have to come back over here in the public meeting, reconvene if there's new information. But when we go to the board, we would like to have it really ironed out to capture all we can on the facts and science on best management practices. And to point out to the board if what the contentious issues or disagreements may be out there. So we're just not, this process here, I think we feel comfortable kind of capturing everything we need to, but that's kind of like another checking with the public out there at large. So they have an opportunity to comment to us. So but once the board does a first vote, that kicks in some formal legal processes, public hearings. We start going through a formal process to adopt rule language. But we find it a lot better to have information techniques before we get into the regulatory formal process. Thanks.
So we get more vague as we get down here because in December, we may need to reconvene this group again. We hope that by sometime in December, we could have recommendations to the commissioner and the board after we finish this process. And then, once that happens, there'll be a report to the legislature, and then the board, the rulemaking process will have more public meetings as the board gets involved, right?
Yeah, that'll be their decision, where and when, how many public hearings to hold once they complete the first vote.
So that's where we think we're headed. And did we give out all the handouts, Chris? I think.
Gotta get the charge on the.
Oh, that's all right. Well, I have the legislative mandate, which I'll hand out here too. But you would just pass it.
Like Jim's hanging that out, I just want to make one more comment on the process. This was an ambitious aspiration process to follow this timeline. I also want to be sensitive to people out there who care about this and want to make sure they have ample time to hear about the work you do. So I do know when I try to hold public meetings or hearings in November, there's about 70,000 people in this state who are not going to be sitting in front of a computer or going to a public meeting. They usually plan their family vacations to deer hunt or do things like that. So I'm nervous when people do that because they may feel alienated in the process at the same time with all of you. So I share this with you that if you've got some other thoughts and ideas too about this timeline, please let us know. We're not wedded to it. It's just we want to get something out there for targets for us and you to work on.
Yeah. And so one of the other challenges we'll all have is that, as we create these recommendations, they need to be like clear and applicable. They need to be practical and enforceable. So that's one reason why we wanted to have somebody from law enforcement in both of the working groups, because I think it's really important that you guys weigh in on whether or not the ideas that people are coming up with are actually something that we can carry out. So I think what we can do, we will have pizza at 6 o'clock, and then Brian White will be doing a presentation at around 6:10. So in the meantime, after his presentation, we're going to break you into two groups, and we've already sort of figured out who's in what group. But in the meantime, what I think we can do in preparation, there's some charges that the groups will have. Why don't we just give out those things so that people have time? Take the next 15 minutes maybe, and we have had 3 petitions in the last 3 years that have come. One has not gotten to the board yet, but the other 2 have. And we'll use these as sort of the beginnings of what we need to talk about. So I'm giving these out ahead of time so that you folks can get a chance to read through them, because you'll have 3 charges in your breakout groups related to these 3 petitions. So
So take some time to just read through these. You're going to be reviewing each one of these to determine what falls within the legislative mandate and what doesn't. You're going to try as a group to identify any common ground in any of these petitions. And then you're going to generate, as you're reading through them, if you have questions that come up as you go through them, that you want us to investigate and research in between this meeting and the next meeting, you're going to try to generate some questions based on what you read here, the things that we need to look into before the next meeting to help us continue further. Did everybody get the BTA petition?
I was gonna ask you, I got this,
Yeah, that's it. That's the one from the BTA.
it's two others.
There's this one,
Oh, this,
this
okay,
one,
that, these
and
two,
then,
these two.
yeah,
Okay,
those
got it.
two.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
okay.
Hey, can I ask one clarifying question?
Hello. How are you? Yeah, just getting here. Have a seat there. Senator Bray has arrived, and we'll give you a minute to get settled, and then you can just introduce yourself. Go ahead, Tom.
And I'm just trying to understand sort of where we're at,
Yeah.
but this is our legislative mandate for what we're operating.
Right,
It doesn't refer to petitions.
right. It does
And you
not.
give us 3 petitions to use as a source of,
So our charge in the legislative mandate is to, if you don't want me, let me just borrow it. We should include, the BMP shall include, so we're trying to develop BMP regulations. The BMP regulations should include trapping devices and components of trapping devices that are more humane than currently authorized devices and are designed to minimize injury, criteria for adjusting or maintaining trapping devices, trapping techniques, including the appropriate size and type of trap, requirements for the location of trap, including the placing of traps for purposes other than nuisance trapping, criteria for when and how live captured animals should be released or dispatched, and revisions to trapper education. These 3 petitions, one is submitted by the Vermont Trappers Association that addresses BMPs and trapping systems and how to revise trapping systems to meet their perspective from BMPs. There's one from POW that talks about locations of traps based on trail locations, which could address number 4 in the.
please help my copy.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. And then there's another petition from POW, HFUS, and Green Mountain Animal Defenders that has a whole list of bulleted items that we need to determine which ones of those fall under this. Okay. If everybody, is that clear to everybody? I didn't mean to talk directly to Tom, but that makes sense to people? Okay. Senator Bray, I'm gonna just give you some handouts, sorry. This is fine. I want you to cut and paste that right out. This was just, we're working towards consensus. And then these are the ground rules that we just went through as we added one on the income place of the village. So that is, and then these are the 3 petitions. Now, just as one for the Vermont Trappers. The Rockland and Green Mountain, just US and here's one. We're sort of reviewing those right now to see whether they fall within the sideboards that we're using, which is the legislature. But I think if everybody has a second, I would just like Senator Bray to introduce himself. So everybody knows, what we did was a little bit about who we represent, what our backgrounds were, but then also your first job. Right there, beautiful. A what?
Paperboy.
Oh, a paper boy. We hadn't had that one yet.
My name is Rich Bray. I'm a state senator. I live in Bristol, Vermont. Which I can go aft gap to here. Be straightforward. This time I went aft gap to Waitsfield and turn me around. I had to go back over the mountain
Oh,
and then go out around. So sorry I'm late.
oh my
Um,
God.
I chair the Natural Resources and Energy Committee. And that committee that, we had a bill as 201 that became law that is, triggered this working group. And I would say, thank you to everyone who's here for participating, because one of the things we definitely learned as a committee is that it's a complicated topic with a lot of different aspects to it. It's a lot to learn. And so, as is often the case, when something exceeds the legislature's capacity to really dig in and resolve something, we look to expert groups outside. They help gather information, process that information, make recommendations, and then it informs the next legislature so that they can begin to better. Sorry, I'm late. Thank you, and I look forward to learning more volunteers and then seeing what kind of recommendations.
Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you going back over the mountain and finding another way around. And I'll get you another copy of.
Thanks, Frank.
Yeah. Do you need a highlighter? No, no, no. That one.
When you've gone through these and you feel comfortable that you can discuss them, feel free to go get your pizza. There's a bathroom right around the corner here, if anybody needs to use that. There's drinks in that cooler. There's a water cooler out around the corner as well. So we're gonna actually start the presentation at 6:10. So just, you got about 15 minutes to kind of get your dinner, come back and eat it, or go get drinks, or go to the bathroom, and then we'll be back here at 6:10.
Water cooler too, up the hallway.
Right.
Everybody wants to drink water. Free water. If they wanted to not need it.
Yes.
We can have some flavored water.
But they can hear us.
That's your problem. This is free water.
Just kind of. Some of those colors. Are kind of are well. So it come out.
Yeah.
Yeah. 3-year-old. Yes, you can. Oh, it's wrong. Big steel centers. I don't know.
So, yeah, I mean, I know where I should. You know, I think nobody's done it before. Okay.
You're ready back today. I didn't really thought right all, I just wanted to know you.
Thanks.
I use the race sticker on my strategy. I
don't know how it all works. I didn't say anything like that. I didn't see anything else. So it'd be fun to see how that figure out. Really, man, it's all right. It's all right. For a while. Get you up to what's on there.
You should bring up your idea about that the third meeting dinners. I really think.
The jamboree. St. James.
Or anybody. who doesn't do it.
Like Jenny said, she's.
I want to see how the game will be. No, I mean, I think it would be a novel thing to do. I also think we could bring it up and have it. Don't let me forget.
Well, it was great.
At the end of today.
I really like, let's
So
see.
just bring it up for maybe the last September 8th. Yeah, right. We'll be back this fall.
Guys, I still have through that over. Actually, I'm just a little bit there.
Teaching two classes.
typically do I'm not in construction every day, I do there's placement, so students in there, I should have taken job shadows. So they raise their knowledge,
Yeah.
educate some of our kids who are ready to go
Yeah.
to work.
Yeah, yeah.
Council tenants that are certainly, if you meet them, say,
It's great. So they can say, right, first job you want. Somebody that was.
Every fun while, I play three places. They'll sign on an hour, work full time this last year, and for me, that's like, heaven.
Yeah.
People are so excited.
Yeah. Down the road for me.
I was looking to running for province now. Most of the first morning, I didn't know that it was my promotion, I renovated. Way down to the bottom. First of all, one six, walking on just. Go to Richmond.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I would say.
So little. Feels like we're in this knowledge.
Yeah, sure.
You interact with people. You don't have to be on. You are really. Yeah. Other places. Way to get over it.
Sorry, I'm allowed to do these.
Flagship.
I think they talk about that, I think three. They are, they are like, slow. But it will all, you'll get that, 0.5. Although I think it's sort of what it took until like 25 years. Work out better.
Mine are pretty good right now. They're not bad.
How old are you?
19.
I found that Margaret will see. After they graduate. What are you gonna do?
I was worried if something happened. My oldest went to college. Grad school.
I never forget that.
And my youngest was like, I'm gonna go to college. And I was like, but then I was like, I'm not sure how long this is gonna be okay.
But don't go crazy.
And,
How do I feel it comes
well, so then every week, you have a full-time job as a medical assistant. And then.
Wow. I'm done. You're done. You're done.
We'll see how long it takes her, but if they come back.
There is a pretty good feeling if you get to that point. We are, everything considered. Okay. I've done what I can do.
I was surprised because my. Yeah. It'll be nice to say that you know, free spirit of observation. No, it's not that long. Yeah, you've got 10 years. If you don't get the job done in the next 10 years, it's.
Although it doesn't usually don't have a lot of added step, very-
If you're gonna do the job, but yes.
That's really nice job.
I couldn't say anything after that. It's.
You don't have something. Once you get, like, you're losing control and create space, so.
Yeah.
So, although you can still carry.
Still pick them up.
Yeah. So as long as you can still do that. You can still.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't have to walk for that.
It's almost, yeah. It's the other cooperation, so I thought it was
Everybody tells you it's going to rain fast, you know.
And we thought you wanted to hear from. Just wanted to talk a little. You know, it's like for the rest of the. Yeah, I'm not back outside. Lucky.
Hey, Fred? We probably, is Bryant waiting?
He's, you know, he's.
Oh, yeah. Did you let him in already?
I did, I think maybe.
Oh, Chris did, okay. So before, I think Bryant and Dan can hear us.
We can.
I
Can you
wanted to
hear us?
introduce them, and anybody else, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, David Dean.
I think not everybody's back yet, right? Oh, Tom's here, okay. Is everybody else here? So I think the meat of tonight's meeting will be this presentation by Bryant White and Dr. Dan Grove. And just a little background on both of them. Brian's currently the policy program manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And that's an organization that represents all 50 states, brings them together with federal wildlife agencies and non-governmental organizations to enhance fish and wildlife across the country. For the past 20 years, Brian has coordinated research related to the development of best management practices for the conservation of fur-bearing animals through research and liaisons with national and international organizations, including the EU, Russia, and Canada, and education. Brian's authored many peer-reviewed publications and just general audience publications. And I think we sent the monograph out to you guys, but you'll see he's the lead author on this wildlife monograph that is specific to the BMP testing process and the research effort that went on related to that. I actually also think Tom Decker is also one of the major authors for this publication. So we're very grateful to have Tom representing AFWA and Brian willing to give us some background on this. Brian lives in Arizona, so he's calling in from there, and we are very appreciative. Dr. Dan Grove is currently the assistant professor and extension wildlife health specialist for the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture and serves as the wildlife vet for the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency. He worked doing necropsies for the BMP program for upwards of 10 or 15 years. And his career has spanned many states, species, and organizations, including the University of Wisconsin, the National Park Service, the Cape Wildlife Center on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and the North Dakota Game and Fish Department. So please welcome both of those folks, and maybe can we get them so they're Brian and Dan.
Yep, they're unmuted there.
Huh?
They've unmuted, so now they can turn their
Can
video
you
on.
turn your cameras on, you guys?
Yep, my camera's on. I don't know if you can see me yet. I can see me on my
Yeah.
side of things.
Dan's trying. They're both trying.
Yeah, I see you, Dan.
Okay. Can you hear me at least?
Yep, I can hear and see you, Dan, so. This
Okay,
is Brian.
as
Can you
expected,
guys
we
hear
have
me?
few technical difficulties.
Can anyone see or hear me?
I can, David. But I'm not there.
Right.
You can't even hear them, right?
No.
Maybe that's. Not true.
Can you hear us, Brian or Dan?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear us, okay. But you
Kim,
can't
can
turn,
you hear me?
I can hear you, David.
Thank you.
But you can't turn your cameras on?
Mine's on.
Yeah,
Yes.
mine's on
Yeah, we're not
too.
seeing your faces. We're only seeing your initials in a circle. But that might be
Well.
an issue on our end, since we can't see anybody's face.
I just turned it back on and off.
Hang on.
It may not be a
Now I
big
got
deal
it.
if you can't see my face, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can, now you're the only thing I can see.
Oh, you can see Bryant now, David?
Yes, but that's all that I can see.
Okay, well, Chris is working on it.
David, can you see me? This is Dan.
Yeah, as a small set aside picture down at the bottom.
Okay.
So
Went out and went in again.
And Kim, can you hear us in the room there?
We can hear you. Yeah, can everybody hear them pretty well?
Yeah.
We can hear you quite well. We just would like to be able
Okay.
to see you.
hey, Kim, will you be able to see my PowerPoint presentation?
Try sharing it.
Try sharing it, Brian, and see if that
Okay.
works.
Let's see.
Your little circle's blinking, so maybe something's happening.
Best management practices for trapping in the US.
Oh, now we can see, oh, we can see you now. All right.
Okay,
And oh, and it's there. We got it. Woo-hoo, good job, Chris. Stressful, huh? Okay. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Brian is at the top, and then Dan and David Dean is on the board, on the right there. Hi, Dan. Thank you very much for participating.
Not a problem. I'm going to mute myself until Bryant's finished with his stuff. So,
Do you guys think, can you see it well enough, or should we can make it full screen if you want? Or if you want to just keep Brian up there?
I think you can, yeah, full screen would be better.
You think full screen? Okay. All right, we're gonna make it full screen, Brian.
okay.
That's about it. Okay. Okay. Thank you. I don't know if you guys could hear me. I did give you some introductions. I hope I got it accurate. I don't know, Tom, did you hear my introduction? Was it pretty close to, okay. So I think you're ready to go whenever you're comfortable.
Okay, so you guys are seeing my PowerPoint presentation and you can hear me okay?
Yes, thank you. We can see it.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll just jump right into this then. I appreciate the opportunity to address this committee and talk a little bit about the BMP program of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And Dan Grove is here as well, and we'll answer any questions you have at the end of the presentation. So if you can hold your questions until the very end, we'll take those at that time. So, all right, well, I'll get started here. So in 1997, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies started a trap research and education program with the purpose of evaluating trapping devices so that we could use science to improve animal welfare, safety, selectivity, and a few other things, and then encourage those who use traps to use the most humane, safe, and selective devices. And we call it the Best Management Practices for Trapping Program, or we'll just call it the BMP program for short. As Kim's already mentioned, we published some of our results in Wildlife Monographs about a year ago. And if you're familiar with Wildlife Monographs, it is one of the most prestigious, rigorously peer-reviewed scientific journals in the field of wildlife management. And I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back as the lead author, but just to let you know, this is some very credible scientific information that I'm going to be presenting to you today. Before I get into that, I also wanted to assure you that there's a tremendous amount of support for trapping among the groups who know the most about wildlife management and those who know the most about animal welfare. The Wildlife Society, as probably most of you know, is the professional society for wildlife biologists. They have a very positive standing position statement on trapping, and they encourage those engaged in trapping to use traps that have been tested and approved through our BMP program. The American Association of Wildlife Veterinarians is the professional society for wildlife vets. They likewise have a position statement on trapping that's actually specific to foothold traps, and they support the use of those devices. And these are the folks who probably know the most about the welfare of wild animals. Also, the American Veterinary Medical Association has a position statement on trapping, and they also encourage anyone using traps to use traps that have been tested and approved through the BMP program. Something happened with my slide here. Okay, there we go. And of course, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which most of you know includes all 50 state fish and wildlife agencies. It also includes Canadian provincial agencies, and then many federal agencies that manage wildlife and habitats like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA, U.S. Forest Service, USGS, and numerous non-government conservation organizations. And these all support the use of trapping in wildlife management. And then the U.S. public also supports the use of regulated trapping and believes that people should have the freedom to participate in it. And so I mentioned all of that just to let you know that trapping is heavily supported. It's supported by wildlife professionals, veterinarian organizations, government and wildlife agencies, and even the majority of the American public. Now you might ask, well, why is there so much support for this activity? And that's because trapping is critical to successful wildlife management. Agencies use this tool for a lot of different purposes. I've listed 7 of those uses here. There are probably others, but when agencies don't have trapping in their toolbox, it limits their ability to do their job. But now, even with all that said, even with the need for trapping and the support for trapping, we know that trapping is controversial. And what's most controversial about trapping is how animals fare when they get captured in traps, and then also what gets captured in traps. So we're talking about selectivity there. And so the public, agencies, the scientific community, the trapping community are all concerned about that. And so the reason we started the BMP program was simply to address that controversy with science. So let's talk about the BMP program for just a minute. We really had 3 objectives when we started this program. Sorry, I'm having technical issues, but I'll get it all figured out. We really had 3 objectives when we started this program. One was to simply evaluate and improve traps and trapping systems by looking at several different criteria. We also wanted to enhance the awareness and understanding of modern regulated trapping because there are less than 200,000 trappers in the United States, and we know that there are a lot of folks who are not familiar with this activity, and we wanted to address that as well. And then we know that agencies use trapping for many different purposes, and we wanted to sustain that as a wildlife management technique. The group that is really responsible for developing BMPs is the U.S. Fur Bear Conservation Technical Work Group of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And if you're familiar with AFWA, you know that we have about 60 different standing committees, working groups, task forces, and the Fur Bear Conservation Technical Work Group is just one of those. That group is made up of state and federal agency wildlife biologists and wildlife veterinarians, also tribal agencies and trapping experts. We're developing BMPs for 23 species, and at current time, we have a BMP for 22 of those. Wolverine is the only species on that list that we don't have a BMP for as of yet, and we expect to have that within the next 12 to 18 months. So developing a BMP is a fairly intuitive process. First of all, we reviewed past data about trap performance and use, what other researchers had already done. We prioritized the fur bear species and trap types that we were going to actually test, and that was all based on surveys that we did of trappers in the United States. We conduct field projects on an annual basis. We analyze the data from those field projects. We ask trappers quite a few questions about the traps and how they performed. We also take all the animals that are captured in these field projects, and we perform whole body necropsies on these animals. And I'm going to go into great detail on that, and Dan can assist with that some as well. We compare the performance of traps to an international standard, which I'm going to explain as well. And then we synthesize that scientific data and then the experiences from the field, and we produce a trapping BMP for each one of those species. And so our protocol is designed to test traps that are commonly used in modifications, essentially all trap types that are out there for live restraint and also for lethal systems. Okay, there we go. Sorry, my technical issues are returned. All right, I wanted to go into the science for just a minute. The animal welfare criteria that we use was developed by the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. The United States participated in the ISO process through the American National Standards Institute, or what we typically refer to as ANSI. And there were numerous other countries that were involved as well in the ISO process. Within ANSI, there was a technical advisory group that made recommendations, and that group was made up of wildlife pathologists, wildlife veterinarians, wildlife biologists, and other animal experts. And so a testing protocol was developed for live capture, which is part 5 of that. It uses injuries as the evaluation criteria. And then the protocol for lethal capture, which is part 4 of that, uses time to death, or technically irreversible loss of consciousness leading to death. And that's measured by the loss of the subconscious reflexes, the pupillary light reflex, and the corneal blink reflex, which are indicators of brain death. Oops. Trying to get some things to pop up on here. Let's see. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. So the goal of that standard is essentially to not compromise the animal's survival, so that if an animal is released from a trap that meets the criteria, it's not going to be negatively impacted by that event. But even if that animal is going to be harvested, we want to reduce injury to an acceptable level, which we also know reduces the pain, the stress, and the suffering of that animal. So the ISO protocol has 2 injury evaluation criteria. First of all, there's a cumulative injury score, where each injury that could be caused by a capture event has an associated point score, which goes from 2 to 100. And I'm going to show that to you in just a moment. The more severe the injury, the higher the score. And every injury is factored into that. We also look at trauma categories, and that's based on the types, the number, and the severity of injuries that an animal gets. And I'm going to explain those. But we look at physical injury because injuries cause stress, injuries cause pain, injuries cause suffering. And if we can reduce physical injury, we know that we'll reduce the pain, stress, and suffering. And that's really what we're trying to do here. Those who put the ISO protocol together felt that the best way to reduce those things was simply to evaluate and reduce physical injury. So Appendix C of the ISO document is what I'm showing you here on live restraint. It lists 34 different injuries that an animal could receive in a capture event. And I don't know how well you can see those, but hopefully you can just see that, okay, there's at least 34 injuries listed there. I did some little call out boxes to highlight a few things, but you can see that the more severe the injury, the higher the score. So essentially a bruise, edematous swelling, and hemorrhage is a 5-point injury. A fractured bone is a 50-point injury, and so on and so forth. Sorry, my issues continue. There we go. So each injury has a point score, and the way the cumulative injury score system works is that in order for a trap to meet the BMP criteria, the mean score must be less than or equal to 55 points. So we look at the 34 injuries that an animal could have. We have to have at least 20 animals to evaluate per trap type of the same species. So if we were testing the 1.5 coil spring on raccoons, we would have to have at least 20 raccoons for that trap type to evaluate it. Each animal receives a score for every injury, and then we calculate the mean. We also calculate the mode and a few other things as well, and the 95% confidence intervals are calculated as well. Oops, too far. And then we also have the trauma classes Each injury is placed into one of 5 trauma classes. You'll notice that there are only 4 there, the mild, moderate, moderately severe, and severe. These are exactly the same injuries ranked in a different sort of way. But there also is a class of no injury or none, and about 10% of our animals that we capture in approved traps fall into that category. All right, and relative to the trauma scale, 70% or more of the animals in the sample can have no injuries in the moderately severe and severe categories. And of course, while that standard only requires 70% to have none of the moderately severe or severe categories, our results show that about 91% of the animals captured in BMP traps have none of those moderately severe or severe injuries. Or in other words, less than 10% of animals have those injuries. All right, so in order for a trap to be recommended through the BMP program, it must meet both of those criteria. And again, the goal is to not compromise the animal's survival, to reduce injury to an acceptable level, and to reduce pain, suffering, and stress as much as we possibly can. Experienced wildlife veterinary pathologists perform whole body necropsies to score those trap injuries consistent with the ISO procedures. And when we first started this program, we were working with Dr. Victor Nettles and Charlotte Quist at the Southeast Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study at the University of Georgia, and also the late Dr. Beth Williams at the University of Wyoming, and also Tom DiLiberto at the National Wildlife Research Center. We had these folks train additional veterinarians to conduct this work for us after a few years, and Dr. Dan Grove is one of those veterinarians that they trained personally. Initially, we did radiographs to examine for bone damage, and we did that for several thousand animals, and it was determined after numerous necropsies that radiographs were not necessary because our veterinarians were able to locate those injuries with 100% accuracy apart from the radiographs. Usually there are other injuries associated with bone damage, and so it's typically fairly easy to find that bone damage when it occurs. Now, the goal of the welfare criteria for lethal systems or killing systems is to simply kill the animal as quickly as possible, thereby reducing pain, stress, and suffering. That research is all done in Canada in a laboratory setting because the measurements required really can't be done in the field when we're trying to measure the pupillary light reflex and the blink reflex. That's something that has to be done in a lab. And so welfare is evaluated as irreversible loss of consciousness and sensibility leading to death, and that has to occur within 300 seconds in at least 70% of the animals in the sample, and that applies to all species. And again, as I mentioned with the foothold traps and live restraint systems, it's generally a lot more than 70% of the animals that actually meet that 300-second criteria. We also look at efficiency. We want to make sure that the traps we recommend, since agencies are using these for wildlife management and habitat protection and a lot of other important management activities, that these traps are efficient, that they actually capture animals. And so that must be at least 60%. And we measure that by dividing the total number of captures of the target species by the total number of traps that were sprung by that target species. Just going to get all these other criteria up here. These are the last 3 criteria that we look at. These criteria are evaluated qualitatively by experts. There's really no quantitative statistic that we use as a standard to evaluate these, but our ad hoc panel of trapping experts provides comments based on our field data and other data and experiences. As for our study design, we test our traps during the regulated trapping seasons. The reason that we do that is because this protocol is designed to give a good measure of how well and consistently traps actually perform in the field. The U.S. was sort of divided into geographic regions based on habitat types, and so we came up with 5 different regions to do our testing. When we conduct a research project, we usually select one state from each of 2 to 3 of those different regions. They will participate in a single project, and sometimes there are 2 to 3 trappers in each one of those states. And so it's not unusual for us to have 25 or so volunteer trapper teams in the field each year. Volunteer expert trappers conduct trapping on their usual trap line. Those traps are randomly selected, and so there's a random allocation table that's provided with the technician manual. And so the trapper selects a location to set a trap, and then the technician stipulates from the random trap allocation table which trap must be set at a particular location. We typically also set those traps in pairs because that maximizes the opportunity for capture in a short period of time, which we're conducting a field project. Technicians accompany trappers on the trap line. Those technicians record the data that we need from the field. They record about 25 different types of data at each trap site. They also take the carcass immediately from the trapper, and they prepare the carcasses for necropsy by the veterinarians. And so what is a trapping BMP? If you haven't seen one of these, there's a separate BMP for each one of the 22 species. It provides some basic biological, ecological information about that particular species of animal. It details the trapping devices that meet the BMP criteria. And then if there is anything unique that we did that we believe helped get the results that we got, we detail those techniques of how best to use the traps so that other people can get the same results we did. Our goal for BMPs is simply to be a supplement to trapper education, to implement those into trapper education programs. And so next I want to share some of our results, our real results, and show you a few of what we call our science briefs. These are available on our website. We've widely circulated these, and you can find these and download them and have a look at them. But they're really a distillation of some of the most useful and best information that we've gathered through research. And so we've tested 600 trap types on 23 different species of fur bears. That's across all 5 U.S. regions in 41 different states. There are numerous trap types that meet the ISO standards for every common species. 41% of the traps that we've tested fail the standards. We also know from surveys of trappers that about 80% of fur bears in the United States are being captured already in traps that meet the BMP ISO criteria, and about 10% are being captured in devices that we've not yet tested. And so our testing continues as a result of that. We also know that 99.995% of fur bears were alive in live capture traps or dead in lethal trapping systems. So the next thing, we also have a science brief on selectivity and another on safety. And so 93% of the times when our trappers set a trap in one of our research projects, they captured a fur bear. They captured either the fur bear they were trying to capture or another species of legal fur bear. We've had no captures of any endangered species. And again, that's across 41 states in all 5 U.S. regions since 1997, and over 500 individual research projects that we've conducted. We've not captured any human beings, maybe except a trapper or 2 by the finger. 2% of our captures were free-ranging dogs in live capture systems. None of those dogs required veterinary care, and we had no captures of dogs in lethal sets. 3% of our captures were feral or free-ranging cats, and only 2 of those were dead in live capture systems. Besides those science briefs on animal welfare and selectivity and safety, we have others on how trapping is sustainable, how it helps manage populations sustainably, and how trapping fits within the North American model of wildlife conservation. And again, those are available on our website and you can have a look at those. Well, all right. And then finally, I did want to let you know, and probably most of you know already, that AFWA does have an online trapper education course. It's based on the hunter education approach. It has content standards, learning objectives that are approved by the International Hunter Education Association. Our goal was to try to standardize trapper education nationally and also make sure that trappers were educated about BMPs and about BMP traps. And then I'll pop that up there. These is QR codes that you could use with your smartphone to actually go to the websites where we house all this information. And thank you, Kim, and thank you to the committee. That ends my presentation today. And Dan and I will try to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I'd like to, we actually have, 20 minutes to even a little longer if you want to answer any questions. Now's the time to ask these questions because, Brian is the expert. Dan has a lot of experience and I think anything you think that you need to know in order to start working on some of these recommendations would be helpful to ask Brian now.
Can you hear me? I'm sure.
Can you hear Kevin, Brian?
Brian, can you hear me?
I hear somebody. Yes.
Okay, Kevin Lawrence is asking the question.
Hi, Brian.
Hi,
I'm working
Kevin.
on a proposal from one of our organizations and they made this statement. Can you tell me how this relates to BMPs? They said notably up to 30% of animals caught in restraining traps, such as leg hold traps, can suffer from severe trauma, such as amputation, compound fractures, severe internal organ damage, spinal cord injury, or death, and still meet the BMP criteria. What, is that a true statement?
So Kevin, yes, that is a true statement. The standard does allow that. However, what we have found is that only about 9% of animals have those injuries. So 91% of the animals do not sustain any of those injuries at all.
It seemed like spinal cord injury was also something that was necessary for like weasel trapping. And you're using a big trap, even the snap traps must have caused that damage and to kill it. Is that true?
Dan, do you want to field that question? I don't know if you did any of the weasel necropsies.
No, I believe the weasels were done before I started on the BMPs. I guess I want to clarify what the question actually is. Also, I guess I'm not understanding what the question is.
Sure. And foothold traps are used for weasels and weasel boxes. And the outcome that's suggested is a good thing is that the weasel dies in that trap, that foothold trap, because it catches them high around the chest, as well as snap traps like big rat traps are BMP approved traps that you folks have approved over the years. And so again, the outcome would be a spinal cord injury and death, from those situations. I just wondered how that fit into the whole criteria of, if that was the intended outcome, it doesn't seem like a bad thing. It seems like the right thing.
Are you asking if the trap would pass?
Yeah.
In that case, in that situation?
Well, the trap did pass, like the
Yeah.
number one long spring, yeah.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that one. Yes, because that would, in that case, that foothold trap is being used as a lethal trap, or the snap trap, the typical rat trap, that's a lethal trap. And so that, is we don't look at the injuries that animals receive for lethal systems. That's all evaluated as, time to irreversible loss of consciousness.
Thank you.
Brenna has a question, Brian.
Hi, Brian. Nice to actually see you. We talked on the phone a couple of weeks ago. You had mentioned selectivity as part of the BMP process with a pretty high selectivity rate of, I think, 93% or 95%. And I know that the testing did not test that for individual fur bearer species. And I know that there is great concern, I was involved in the conversation in the legislature to reduce non-target captures of certain fur bearers, because you might have a trapper who wants to specifically trap a coyote, not a bobcat. And your BMP testing did not take that into consideration. Is there a reason why? Because I think non-target captures, whether it's captured a gray fox or bobcat in a coyote set or another animal, that's something that I think a lot of us are concerned with, and your testing did not test for that.
Well, so obviously we do calculate a statistic on that. But the reason that we did not report that, first of all, we consider any fur bearer, a capture target. Most of the time when a trapper sets a trap, maybe targeting multiple fur bearers. But also because we know that statistic is very density dependent, depends on how many animals of, the particular type you're trying to catch are in that area. So density dependence is a really critical factor, and we can't always, evaluate that. So we have those statistics. We just simply did not report those because of some of the issues that create variability, a huge variability in that statistic. So does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, yes. Thank you.
Rob Mullen has a question, Brian.
Hi, Brian. I enjoyed listening to your presentation.
Thank you.
You said one of the main goals for live capture systems is to not compromise the animal's survival. And when listening to you said all the captures were necropsied afterwards. I'm just wondering how you determine survivability of a released animal.
Well, so that standard is set, and I might allow Dan to chime in here for just a minute, but really that standard is set based on the expert opinions of wildlife veterinarians and wildlife pathologists that an animal that receives that level of injury that meets the criteria could be released and could survive really unimpeded. It would be able to continue to do what it has to do to survive. Dan, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, these necropsies, they're not kind of like the standard necropsy that most veterinarians are trained to do. We look at every small little detail. Survivability, at least from my background, I spent 4 years of my career at various points in time working in wildlife rehab. And so I've seen both sides of like what an animal can actually, like with treatment could actually survive. And then also without treatment, what an animal could actually survive. And so the scoring system itself is actually geared towards getting at that. Because like if you have a little bit of bruising or swelling as a result of a trap injury, that's not necessarily going to cause long-term pain for that animal to where it can't function in the wild. Part of what we can take into consideration is the species itself and what it does for a living. So depending on the injury type, could that animal survive that injury and actually be able to function like it normally would? So if we're talking like badgers or something that need to use their feet for digging, less severe lesions may lead to that animal not functioning. And so that all gets taken into consideration when we're looking at these. Other things like you look at it from the outside, and you may not see any lesions. But whenever you actually get into and cut open and look in underneath the skin, there's erosions on the bone surface where the periosteum has been eroded. And in some, most species, that'll actually lead to what's called a sequestrum, and that animal will receive pain from that. Those kind of traps that externally, if you were just to look at it, be like, oh, there's no injury here. those are the kind of traps that we actually end up failing because underneath there's a lot more damage. And so that's part of the critical part of all of this is actually being able to take and look and see, because it's not just what is on the outside of the skin. Like just because you don't see holes in the skin doesn't mean that trap would pass. There's a lot of damage that can actually occur as a result of a trap without ever causing any damage to the skin. And so this whole process with the evaluation of down to being able to assess if the periosteum has been damaged or if there's bony erosion, all things that can occur without any damage to the skin, it ensures that traps that somebody might perceive, oh, this would never cause a problem, that those traps actually don't end up passing because they are causing a lot worse damage than what the standard observer could actually see. So the whole process is designed to take and look at these things. I mean, it's a tedious process, especially for footholds and things like that, which are what most of our live capture devices and a lot of our species are. We spend a lot of time dissecting out each toe and looking at all the damage that has potentially occurred as a result of that trap. And then again, like I mentioned, taking into account the biology of that species and would that lesion actually be survivable based on the damage that we see, and how quickly could that animal recover from the potential damage that we've seen. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, and one thing I would throw in, Dan, you were talking about all the detail that you guys go into when you're doing the necropsies. It typically takes one of our veterinarians about an hour to do the necropsy on one animal. It's a very extensive process, and so I usually allow at least an hour per animal for each one of our vets to look at those. And typically when we do these necropsies, we have multiple vets on site. I think this year we had 6 different wildlife veterinarians there that were participating in the necropsies, and they can ask each other questions. They can all look at the same animal, so they can put their heads together and really figure things out. And I think that's a really good system that we have in place.
And these are blind necropsies, Brian. The vets do not know which foot was the trap was on, and right?
Right. The vets don't know what type of trap was used. Typically, they may know it was a foothold trap or a cable restraint device. We usually give them, but they typically won't know which foot was captured or what specific trap was actually being used to capture that animal. So it is a blind test.
And and that also helps in the fact that we don't zero in on a particular foot. We look at every single foot because part of this process too is not just evaluating the part of the animal that got trapped. It's did the rest of the animal fare well? Because you might have like a foot injury on one foot from where the trap actually caught, but they may have struggled in the trap and caused other problems, like with somewhere else on their body, or they got wrapped up. If there was a cable associated with it or a chain length associated with it, they could have gotten another limb injured in that other part of that trap, and not just the part of the animal that got caught in the trap. And so all that gets evaluated. Basically, it's nose to tail when we look at these things. And every little bit of injury, even if the animal was dispatched using a firearm, all those injuries get recorded so that we have a complete evaluation of that animal. So it's a really, I mean, compared to a normal necropsy, it takes 2 to 3 times as long to do a BMP necropsy as it would to do a diagnostic necropsy for unknown disease causes and things like that.
Would you ever, I appreciate something very thorough and honest effort. Would you in the future possibly consider radio collar, radio transmitter studies to actually test the released animal, see if, and there's, constriction injuries can lead to metabolic poisons building up your animals in the trap 12, 15 hours, like that. And when that is reinfused with blood, those toxins can cause problems. Physiological are not going to show. I don't know. I'm not a veterinarian. I do have a degree in biology, but I understand those metabolic toxins can cause problems when they get into the organs after the foot is released from the trap. But that's not going to happen if it's dispatched and necropsy. So that sort of thing would be hard to tell from that crossing, I'm guessing, and would a radio collar program help give you more information on that?
I'll let Brian answer, but I'll kind of respond to it first. Keep in mind, a lot of these live capture restraint traps are currently being used by state agencies that are actively trapping, marking, and releasing animals. And so indirectly, there is that kind of information that's out there because they're doing survivability studies, especially species that they may be abundant in one state. Like when I was in North Dakota, otters made their way back into the state. So we didn't have a season on them. So we were actually doing projects to trap them and release them, and just to kind of figure out where they were. So those studies are already actually occurring and have been occurring during this whole process. But I'll defer to Bryant in terms of actually specifically for the BMP program.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of echo what Dan said. There are numerous scientific studies out there where researchers have either captured animals themselves with foothold traps or cable restraint devices, those types of devices, and put radio collars on animals. There are also a number of studies published where agencies used trappers participating in regulated trapping programs that captured animals, and then the agency put radio collars on those animals and released them for scientific studies. And so there's a really good study that came out of Wisconsin not too long ago where they did something like that with bobcats. They captured, 40 or so bobcats, released them. I don't think they had any incidental mortality as a result of that. And then probably one of the biggest studies that I'm aware of was done by Dr. Stan Gert at the University of Ohio. For over 15 years, they were capturing coyotes in live restraint traps in the city of Chicago, putting radio collars on those animals. Some of those animals lived for 13 or 14 years after that capture event, but they had a really high incidence of survival. I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but I don't know that they had really any animals that died as a result of what we might call capture myopathy. So would the BMP program consider doing that? At this point in time, I don't think we need to, because there are so many other published studies out there where folks have done, what you're talking about and had really high survival rates of those animals. So we know that they do survive.
You had a comment, Tom Decker?
Right, this is Tom. The other thing I would add to your point, which is very logical, in the beginning of the BMP conversations about this concept of survivability as being an important element, there was heavy deference to the wildlife veterinarians who were doing the evaluation to give their interpretation of whether survivability would happen or what would happen thereafter. But the other part of the equation was there were many state fur bearer biologists in the room who had captured hundreds of river otters or hundreds of coyotes or hundreds of raccoons, and either through implants or radio telemetry studies for habitat use, movement, survivability, had firsthand experience using those devices, and would often challenge the veterinarians about, well, how do you know that? And those biologists at least had overall survivability up to what you're talking about, 2 collared animals. Now those studies, some of them were designed to look at survival, mortality, agent-specific mortality, but that was another part of the conversation as this facet was being described about survivability. But the heavy deference was to the veterinarians about their impression. Some of them had rehab experience, some of them had other experience, but it was a combination of those conversations that sort of brought about this element of survivability for a species.
I don't want to take up all the time. My one final refinement on that would be how much of an effect on survivability would be time in the trap. Say if you're a researcher and you get out there several times a day to check the traps, or if you're a regular trapper who's going out once a day, and it's the animal being the trap for 4 hours, or might be in it for 16 hours, or however many. 16 hours with a lot of blood restriction to a limb can cause obviously a high, I would presume, higher incidence, and that's probably not. Is that something that gets reflected in this research you were doing?
Did you hear the question, Brian and Dan?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's actually kind of where one of the things that I didn't mention There is, whenever you look at these lesions, there's a certain amount of what we call edema and swelling, and I believe this is where you were going earlier. I think it's the same person. Sorry, I can't, and on my screen, everybody's really tiny, so I don't know who's asking questions. But in terms of the toxins and things like that, that does correspond with the amount of damage that you see. And so if you're looking at a trap that didn't cause any damage. And Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, these are 24-hour trap checks, or is it twice a day trap checks?
Yeah, no,
So
once a day, once per day.
once a
24
day,
hours.
once a day trap checks on these. And obviously, like the damage that we see could actually be correlated to the amount of tissue toxins that are released. Because if you don't see any damage, then there's not going to be any tissue toxins released as a result of cellular death. At least not in any amount that would lead to any kind of systemic issues. You can tell by whenever a trap, basically, if you are building up and causing issues, you can actually tell by the amount of edema, hemorrhage, and things like that that occur below the trap. So would the scenario that you posed with releasing that constriction and then having all those toxins go back, those are typically the traps that actually end up failing because they did cause all that kind of edema and swelling and hemorrhage, because those are actually rated as more severe. And so, like, whenever you're talking about toxins being released back in, it's those ones that have swelled up, because otherwise there's normal blood flow that's occurring through there. Because you can actually tell visually that there has been constriction of the blood flow in that particular limb whenever you look at it on necropsy, and that's as evidenced by hemorrhage and swelling, tissue damage, and things like that we can actually visually see. So, and hopefully that answers the original question. It was one of those things where trying to interpret what everybody's specifically getting at is a little bit hard sometimes, but I hope that helps answer that.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just.
Oh, go ahead, Brian, and then
No.
after you, Brenda has a question.
Okay, no, I was just gonna say that we do require our trappers to check their traps each day before noon. So that may restrict the number of traps that they can actually put out in the field. But even so, other than Dan being able to look at animals and tell potentially how long they've been in a trap, when a trapper goes back to check that trap, the trapper doesn't know how long that animal's been there. It could have been there for an hour. It could have been there for 23 hours. And so that's information that we just don't have. Even though we do a daily check, it's hard to know how long an animal has been in a trap. But as Dan said, the necropsy sometimes can help understand that.
Go ahead, Brenda.
You partially answered my question, Brian. Is it possible that some trappers and their technicians in the field, they could have been checking their traps every 8 hours or every 10 hours, or the only requirement was once daily before noon? But was there any record of how frequently someone checked a trap? I mean, do we know how many trappers check their traps every 8 hours, 10 hours? That all makes a difference, and I didn't see that in the paper.
Yeah, no, our protocol stipulates that they have to check, that they can only check the trap once per day, and it has to be checked before noon. We specifically tell them in the protocol not to check the traps more often than that, unless they get a call from someone, from the public saying that there's an animal in the trap or something like that, and then they're supposed to go and remove that animal from the trap. But otherwise, they're not supposed to check it more than once a day. And we do have record of the times that they actually check those traps each day. That's one of the pieces of data that the technician records, is the exact time the trap was checked.
And they also recorded the time it was set as well, right? Yeah.
And keep in mind, part of that protocol too is to increase your effectiveness of your trap. If I've done a lot of trapping of all kinds of species in my time, and the more frequently you're actually checking, the less success you're actually going to have, because you're visiting that site on a regular basis. So part of the protocol is built in to make the traps effective at doing what they're supposed to do.
Go ahead, Senator Bray.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm not sure if I'm remembering this number right. the score that allows a trap to pass was 55 points. And I'm just wondering how you determine that and, yeah, that's the number of it. How do you come up with 55 and why not 50 or 60?
Well, I'll let Dan jump in here. We answered some of that a little bit earlier. And the reason that 55 was selected is, and Tom Decker had mentioned some of this as well. Among the pathologists and veterinarians and biologists that were helping to, that were participating in that technical advisory group and the discussions when we were actually creating our BMP criteria, they all felt that setting that score at 55 points, the injuries that would accumulate to that score would not impact the animal's survival. And so that's why we set it at 55 points. And Dan or Tom, I know you guys discussed that a little bit. Do you want to add anything to what I just said?
In terms of, one other thing to consider with this is, so like, I'll use the example of the skin lesion again. Like we might only record like a 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter skin lesion, which is like basically a pinprick. But if we had, say, 10 of those, all those get added up. And so it's not just, oh, well, we had one, we had 10 of them. And so part of that process, it adds up in that cumulative, because it's not just you score that one time for all 10 of them. You get 10 individual series of points for that when the scoring systems, because 10 holes is way worse than one hole, correct? So it's every lesion gets added up, and the size of, like, we even measure how much hemorrhage. So like, where does the hemorrhage start and where does it end? Where does the edema start? Where does it end? And every little centimeter, millimeter of hemorrhage additional actually adds to that score. So it doesn't take much to get up to that score, to be honest with you. And so that's part of that process is actually doing those finite kind of measurements during the necropsy process. And so it's not just a matter of, okay, we've got one series of holes, we're going to count that as just, that's 5 points. No, each one of those holes is 5 points. So it adds up. So it is a cumulative type thing. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, and to add what Dan said specifically, a fracture below the carpus or tarsus, which we're talking about, a fracture on the foot somewhere, that's a 50-point injury. And that may seem like, well, that's maybe we should ascribe more points to that, but no, that's a 50-point injury. But there are also other injuries that are going to be associated with that. You're never going to have a fracture without a lot of other injuries associated with that. So that may be a 50-point injury, but you're also going to have edema. You're going to have lacerations. You're probably going to have a number of other injuries. And so, an animal with a fracture is not going to pass. It's not going to do it because it's a cumulative system that looks at every injury that the animal has.
And keep in mind the injuries that aren't even associated with the trap factor into that too. Like if they crack a canine because they were chewing on the foothold or they were chewing on part of the device, that actually factors a lot into this. So the other injuries that they may sustain as a result of the trapping incident, not even directly related to the trap itself, all factor into this. And a lot of times we do. There's certain species, they are more likely to chew on traps. And we will have a lot of times canines that are fractured down below the gum line, and that's not a sustainable injury. That I forget how many points are specifically ascribed to that. But that is that in my mind, that makes that trap go from, even if there were no injuries on the foot whatsoever, they have a cracked canine because they were chewing on that trap might fail just because of that cracked canine, which wasn't actually directly related to the trap itself. It was a secondary action of being trapped. So those, whenever you see these scores and things, it's not just right there at the point where that trap hit. It's everything involved. If it's a cable restraint device and it slipped back and forth because it didn't lock down quickly, and there's a lot of injury on the neck or something, that all factors into it. Even though the device worked the way it was supposed to, that might actually have caused way more damage than in another animal or another species. Other things that we look at sometimes, we call it a hip capture. Sometimes the animals, foxes in particular, are pretty fast and they'll slip through a cable restraint device and they'll catch around the hips. We actually go in and we look inside their abdomen and everything else to make sure there's not other damage. I had one just this last time we did it where it had damage to its bladder, its urinary bladder. And you couldn't see that from the outside. There was no damage on the skin. There was nothing. But looking at that, that was a trap set failure as well as a trap failure to cause that kind of damage, because that would lead to long-term pain. And we note all of those kind of things. So it's not just focusing on the particular injury that everybody just kind of assumes. There's other injuries that may occur, and those get factored in too.
Questions? Yeah, go ahead, Joanne. Joanne, go ahead.
Hi, Brian. I remember you said that the trafficking research project began in 1997. I'm curious if some of the painful injuries listed as moderate, like eye lacerations, root fractures, severe joint hemorrhage, would be acceptable in 2022. Is there a desire to revisit and update mammal trapping standards based on changing public opinions, on public attitudes towards animals and animal welfare, as well as changing science and technology in some traps?
Well, first I'll defer to Dan for just a second. I don't know that we've ever seen an eye laceration, fractured ribs. Those would be extremely unusual injuries to see, but they are listed. And we're going to play cards now. Does that mean we're done here? No, I appreciate that. And so while those injuries could potentially occur from a capture event, I think they're extremely rare injuries. I think if we were seeing a lot of those injuries, sure, we might reconsider, but I think those are extremely rare injuries. Dan, would you agree with me on that, on fractured ribs and eye lacerations? We do see some joint luxations, but that's a very high point score injury. And if there's a joint luxation, there will typically be a lot of other injuries associated with that. So that animal is typically not going to pass if it has a joint luxation. So,
yeah, and it goes back to keeping in mind that 41% of the traps that have been looked at so far have failed. So if there were some of those injuries, those are probably associated with the traps that have failed. I guess what I would say is, again, we're blinded to the actual trap that was used, other than knowing that it was a foothold or some sort of a cable restraint device potentially. And again, after you've done these for long enough, you understand what the lesions are associated with a certain type of trap, but you may not know that it was what the weight of the trap was, what the size of the trap was, those kind of things. In terms of those different injuries, only time I'd say that I'd ever seen them, it was because it was a trap that it trapped the animal in a way it was not intended to trap the animal. I'll go back to the fox example. Foxes, like for a cable restraint device, if you're using a cable restraint device, you kind of want it to set around the neck. Well, if the animal slips through and because the loop is too wide, or for whatever reason is able to get through before it cinches down the way it's supposed to, you may capture that animal in a location on its body that it was not intended to be captured. And that happens. Again, it goes into the evaluation process and that goes into part of the recommendation of how traps should actually be set. And so those are usually where I feel that we've seen those if we have seen those injuries. I've not seen eye lacerations per se. I've seen broken ribs, but it was whenever a cable restraint device trapped around the thorax and squeezed down around the thorax. That's not how those are designed to work. So that was a trap failure, and it's noted as such whenever we make our notations on the veterinary side of things. Is if in our impression that this was a failure of the trap, we'll make a note of that.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. You guys reported that 80% of all animals caught today are in ISO traps that are approved traps. And as a trapper education instructor, I can say that's happening in Vermont as well. I'm not sure everybody knows that, but for the last 15 years, every trap I've ever presented in my trapper education classes has been a BMP trap, and they've been adopted by new students. However, in your publication for every single BMP, I read that the best management practices are meant to be implemented in a voluntary and educational approach and do not present a single choice that can or must be applied in all cases. So you say that repeatedly, that it should be voluntary and it should be educational. Obviously, it's working if 80% of the critters caught today are in BMP traps. What are the consequences? I mean, Vermont's considering entering into this BMP process as a legislative tool or a regulatory tool. Why do you suppose that's not happening in 49 other states? So what are the consequences of us doing this today?
Well, and I may defer to Tom Decker somewhat to answer this question. Tom, if you're available to do that, I think you heard the question maybe better than I did. Would you like to take a swing at that one?
So within the context of the development of BMPs, each state agency, territorial agency has jurisdiction over resident wildlife. They regulate wildlife. Other surveys that we've done about the methodology done in each state. Generally, a state has more than 25 regulations related to the take of wildlife, the traps. That's left for the states to decide and choose, just like we're doing here, we're recommending. So the idea of how do you get people to adopt what's best, and best here is based on 5 parameters. We haven't gotten to the other ones. We focus mostly on animal welfare, which is fine. But the idea of how do you get them through a regulatory format, or, well, what are they already using? What's the practices on the landscape now, and how many of them are even accommodated to what we just said was best? And oftentimes that's not known, or oftentimes you can get there through an educational program as versus a regulatory and penalty type program. And so APWA's approach, given the states and the competent authorities to regulate wildlife, put these out as educational venues, develop a national education program to deliver them, and then infuse them into state agency programs that have trapper ed. And 75% of the states offer trapper ed, and many of them it's mandatory on conditional licensing like Vermont. So that's the general approach for APWA in many things. But the investment of the money, $40 million to get this information so that states can use it as they see fit to accommodate, that's the general tenet of how APWA works.
Sean,
You have a question?
yeah, Sean Fowler.
I'm not sure if this question, I'm just gonna open up to all the wildlife professionals in the room. It's going back to a question that Rob had about restraint injuries over time. And the discussion was that a lot of wildlife professionals that are using this are also collaring and they're looking for mortality and that kind of thing. But one thing that stuck out to me that Rob said, and this is my question, is that, you know, a fur trapper as opposed to somebody who's doing it for research and checking that trap twice to 3 times a day, I think is what you said.
That's a couple of the research protocols that I've read.
Okay, that is my question. My question is in many of those things, is that a fair assumption to make? Is it a fair assumption that in many of those instances are these folks that are doing it for research checking those traps multiple times a day as opposed to once in a 24-hour period?
Well,
I can, having been involved in actually some fur bear trapping projects, a lot of times most people that are doing research that's not associated with the BMP project, they're specifically looking at the animal. They'll actually, a lot of traps nowadays you can set up where it sends out a signal. You can either set up a repeater tower, or if you're in an area we actually have cell phone service, it kicks it straight out to a cell phone. We did that. We had a mountain. When I worked for the North Dakota Game Fish Department, we actually had a mountain lion capture project where we're using footholds. As soon as that trap went off, it sent a signal to the grad student, and so we were able to get out there on those animals in time. In terms of this as a practice for trappers, many states actually have trap check laws where you're required to check your traps within X amount of hours, or there's a frequency that's defined, and that seems to be more of what a lot of states are going towards for the trapping end of it. In terms of researchers, we've got other tools that are, they're expensive tools. And they may be cost prohibitive for the general public, but we have tools that we employ so that we know when that animal's in that trap. And we can get out there to that. And that goes for across species, not just fur bear. We do that with deer, and things like that, too, as well as bear and whatnot.
But I think the studies that we did in Vermont, those technologies were not available then. We had a daily trap check for bobcat and coyote. And we used padded traps for coyotes and BMP traps and cage traps for bobcat, and collared them and released them. And I don't believe we saw any injury to any of those animals. And if we used trappers in many cases to actually trap the animals for us using their standard trapping protocol. So, yeah, Tom.
Sean, I don't think there's any data that says among trap research projects today, like what percentage have sort of an exaggerated or accelerated check time. We don't know. We do know from research that more biologists or more studies are using technology to tell about trip rates, but still it depends on the geography. If that studies in suburban New Jersey versus a swamp in Georgia, still may be time. What we do know from the BMPs, and Brian didn't really talk about this in the beginning, but their utilization towards animal welfare and research is most universities have animal care and use committees. They're called IACUMs. They have to sign off on research, particularly federally funded research on animals. And BMPs have become a standard in many institutional animal care and use committees that the researcher has to demonstrate they're operating under those protocols. So we do know the use of BMP standards have influenced research towards what it describes. But to your question, we don't really know about accelerated check.
Yeah, and at least one study that I'm pretty familiar with was the bobcat study that was done in Wisconsin recently. And I believe that information has already been published, but I'm not sure. But Dr. Nathan Roberts was in charge of that. And for that study, they were just using regulated trappers to capture these bobcats. And then, the DNR folks would go out and put radio collars on them. But these were just trappers on their regulated trap time that were checking traps once a day. So they did not know when that trap was sprung. They just knew that there was an animal there the next day when they came back to check that trap. And so the DNR folks would then come out and put a collar on that animal. So that's one study I know where they did not use, more than once a day checks.
In your paper, you multiple times say that there's not one end all be all trap for all species, obviously. But in your management implications section at the end of the paper, you list 5 elements, attributes of a trap, which would probably enhance animal welfare. Did you guys dictate how the chain setups were going to be on the traps as they were used in terms of chain length? Did you dictate that hand tension would be adjusted in certain ways, or was that left up to the experience of the trapper? And would these 5 criteria be appropriate things to recommend for the rulemaking process?
Well, I'll just comment on, what we did as a part of our protocol. We did typically standardize chain length, whether there was a, shock spring in the chain, what the pan tension was supposed to be set at. We did dictate that simply for standardizing our results. So we wanted to make sure that all the trappers, had the same essentially anchoring systems on their traps, and same pan tension set to, avoid non-targets and those types of things. So that was very standardized in the testing that we did. It wasn't standardized across all species, but it was standardized for particular species.
Would any of those 5 criteria be appropriate recommendations for a state to implement as rules for trapping? For instance, the presence of swivels, the use of offset jaws or laminated jaws.
Well, we know that some of those things do improve animal welfare. You know, having a shock spring, having a chain that's not too long, having modified jaws in different ways, whether they're offset or laminated, or whether they have padded jaws, or, you know, different type, having a chain that's center swiveled. We know that those things are important to animal welfare. And so that was an important part of our testing. As far as what states want to regulate, I don't feel like it's my place to comment on that. Maybe Tom could comment on that, but I think they are important for animal welfare, though, for sure.
I think Tom's planning to follow up on that, Ryan.
Okay.
And you can correct me on a little bit, but like to that element, you know, can we say for a regulatory approach, like this element in a system is where the animal welfare value is highest? We actually tried to, with Dr. Matt Lavallo in Pennsylvania, do systems modeling, and we had all this data about system anchoring, chaining, swivel length, lunge spring, to figure out, could you tether out which of those elements in the system were like most valuable? And we really couldn't. Even though we had a lot of large data sets, a lot of animals. The best we could do was come up with those seem to be important values. How much you would regulate one over another or require, can't say. We couldn't say. But we did try to explore, could you say within the systems approach that the whole total trap, anchoring point, chain length, lunge spring, all that stuff, and we just could not come up with results towards what was best outcome. And Brian, you may want to add to that, those studies. Any comments?
No, I'll just say that we standardized our protocol so that we were comparing apples to apples. Different types of traps had the same chaining system attached to it, just to make sure that that chaining system wasn't the one thing that could have been causing a problem. So we standardized that so that all traps got the same evaluation.
Any last questions before we let Brian and Dr. Grove turn their computers off for the day? Thank you again, both of you. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to just get us all on the same page. And thank you, Dr. Grove, especially for the last minute willingness to come on. So it was helpful.
No problem. I'll just say this. I'm always available for questions. I believe you have my email. Feel free to pass that around to the group if there's any questions that people think of after the fact. I'm more than happy to help answer them. I've been doing this for a while and have a good handle on at least the animal welfare side of things associated with this. So,
thank you. And Brian, if we have questions that are generated in our breakout groups, we may circle back with you as well. But really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you, Kim. And yes, anyone there, that has my email address, provide that to everyone. If they want to reach out to me at any time, I'll make myself available for that. So thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, both of you.
thank you.
Thank you.
So our next assignment is we're going to divide into two groups. And you already have sort of looked at the three petitions. What I'd like you to try to do, if you can, is pull out those things that you think fall within the legislative mandate. And maybe if you can get some common ground on what those are, that would be amazing. And really sort of take us down the road towards progress. But you're probably going to have some issues that there's not consensus on, and you can list those. Both groups will have at least 2 flip charts, and you can record these things. And so just also identify where there is common ground, where there's disagreements. And then I think some questions are going to come up in the discussion. And as those questions are generated, keep track of those as well. And we'll investigate any questions that you might have before the next meeting. we are trying not to be influential in this process, but if you would like our help in recording and somebody from the department, we're happy to help you record. If you want to pick a facilitator and a recorder in your own group, that is fine as well. You can start out that way and say, we really need some help with recording, and come back and get one of us. We would leave that up to you. Maybe one group wants to try it one way and one the other. So whatever you think would be helpful to you. We've already come up with the groups. Our attempt here was to try to split people with different expertise into the two different groups. So the green group is Brenna, Mike, Kevin, Martin, Senator Bray, Tom Decker, and Rob Mullen. And the blue group is Bruce, Martin, Sean Fowler, Joanne, Mike Colson, Amy Sheldon isn't here, and I guess, yes, Scott, you, Scott, yes. So I'm wondering, should we leave, Rob, would you want to skip over to this group, or doesn't matter?
Actually, spoke.
Yeah. Well, let's leave it like this for now. Yeah, let's leave it like this for now. So there is a meeting room which Chris will escort the smaller group, the blue group. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Okay, just sort of a point of clarification, so I understand relative to the task at hand. That's sort of our sideboards for what you want our groups to bring forward from that.
Right.
I'm still trying to reconcile the petitions.
Yeah.
As we evaluate that, is it only based on petition content?
No.
Or it's broader?
It's broader.
Okay.
Yes.
And then within the context of some of the petitions, and I don't mean this as criticism, but it gets to Kevin's point of a fresh start. There's sort of statements in here about some devices that would preclude BMP devices outright. So I'm assuming, well, that may be in your petition for the purposes of that mandate, but we're still looking at those devices.
My understanding, and Senator Bray, if you want to jump in, is that that represents the charges from the legislature, minimally, and that those are what you want us to come back with, are something within those 6 recommendations, those 6 mandates.
Correct. I mean, I think that was what we're asking for recommendations on. That said, I would never imagine that the working group would stick only talking changes, and a broader discussion out of which those recommendations would then come. So I wouldn't want anyone feeling strained by the list. Ultimately, that's what we're asking. Yeah, that's conversations goes all over.
Yeah.
On the way there.
Right, but I do think maybe, Tom, what you're asking, this is not supposed to be a referendum on trapping. And the commissioner sort of has made that clear, that that's sort of already understood, that we're talking about how can we improve animal welfare, selectivity, not how do we do away with traps. That conversation would take us down a rabbit hole, and we might never come out of it. So I think we're in good faith trying to come up with good recommendations for modernization. Don.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the petitions that they gave us are still petitions in front of the board. So
Two are petitions in front of the board, as I understand it. One has not.
Next one's closed for them to comment.
Yeah.
Reason being, the board hasn't met when that came in. So they didn't have any meetings, so it's something.
Right.
So the third one that was from the 3 organizations. Board hasn't dealt with that yet.
I guess my point is that instead of giving the board something else to look at, meaning what's coming out of this, is that what's come out of this is this group plus those 2 petitions that go back to the board.
I think that's I mean, you're saying like, hold off on that third.
No, I'm just saying that's the reason we're looking at it.
Oh.
Is we're trying to minimize the amount of work that the board's gonna have.
Plus, I think that there's 3 people representing, 3 different organizations who have an interest in having us consider those. And so, to be completely transparent, we're going to look at them as a group and have a conversation about the bullets in that list. So Chris will escort, yes, oh, sorry, Senator Brink.
No, I just wanted to echo what you said. And had the bill said we were banning playful traffic, would have been an entirely different bill. This was saying, okay, if we're going to have traffic in Vermont, then is there a way to move traffic? As described in the bill, the criteria, and then those recommendations are designed to help us with how we might take.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Okay, so Chris will escort the blue group. There's 2 flip charts. If you need more, let us know. Let me give you some markers. Yeah, take some markers. You guys, if you can try to pick a note taker. If you want one of us, let us know. We're happy to do it. I just want to let you feel like you can be on your own if you want. And green group will stay in here. You're coming back. Okay. Green group stays here. Oh, wait, yeah, green group stays here. Blue group goes. Yeah. So if you guys want to rearrange the tables. Oh, yeah. Another thing I wanted to mention is, you mind if I tell people that they must. If you have questions about Dr. can also answer some veterinary type questions that we have. So, and I'll just tell them this too. Senator Brown, are you like this?
I did stay. I'm having to take notes.
I'm gonna put out. Here on my. Oh, I forgot to jump over. Hey, Chris. Would you just go tell that other group we want to be back by 8:15?
Yeah, I'm gonna go take.
Okay,
Pardon? I'm gonna go take.
okay.
I just need some.
Would you also mention that Walt is available if they have questions about?
Tunnel, I wrote from. Right through. Good run to start.
Tunnel, nice. The tunnel. Yeah. I thought the roads most beautiful compute, but on a little strange day that there was a roadblock all the way down by Bristleback. But they didn't say, that the actual problem was 17 miles away. So I found a way to get out and around that problem. I thought, then I go another 10 miles. Now, there's another way up down here. You gotta go back to the start.
Madison County legislators really should all have a small amount, to be honest. Just do it.
Sure. Yeah, the actual house, I didn't I got there. Yeah, so you got it. You can start the old coach. And they wanted to put yard back in.
From Texas.
Guy from Texas, legally and, working like for that trailer. It's the point.
So
I'm happy to be a scribe.
you can bring this over. If
You get our instruction.
My scribing is utterly.
Are you,
So.
Kim, do you want our points or whatever up on the whiteboard so that everyone can see them?
yeah, that's what we're gonna do is I'm gonna get you two different, I'm using sticky pads so you can put them on the wall if you need to. So that's why I'm changing this out. But I'm gonna get you two easels so you can scribe on two easels. So we got everybody, but Tom Decker's not here yet, right? He must be taking up.
The patterns, putting in the window, list 3 things you'd like us to do. That, break it down someplace else.
Yeah, I didn't, but I will hear. It's these 3 things. Just gonna have Kevin hold them for a second while I find them. So it's to review the stakeholder petitions and determine what falls within the legislative mandate and what doesn't, if anything. Tear off, so.
So we see people to PhD.
Yeah. It's fine. And so where do you teach,
Statewide, typically, I just got the class. So, we got August 17 and like above lake, and September 20. We get real quick. Boston is one of perhaps possible there. Radio says not down. So you did like.
So. Did you want to note taker, you guys?
Well, my experience is that we're all going to try to actively participate. If one of us gets assigned note taker, they won't be able to participate fully. So I would think the department could have a scribe. That's the advantage part.
Is everybody okay with that?
Yes, thank you.
All right, let me.
issue? All the same.
Section 1 is the notice petition, the December 6th, 2021 does follow the criteria for section 4 of the legislative.
Can I ask you a question to the group first? I'm just trying to define mine. So we're talking about using what our actual BMP is. Are we developing sort of what a Vermont BMP would be, and then that kind of would be made into some form of regulatory structure and that the public will follow?
Yeah, so it will eventually, like the recommendation. So, and then there'll be a whole public process, part of doing that rule, but I think what we would find, ask for in the recommendations was, we heard concerns about proximity of tracks, trail. And so then we ended up listening that, so that the group could make recommendations. We were trying to set up some concerns that we heard about. And not make a decision so much as actually.
But my question is, this starts off, this is the BMP shall include or recommend. So to me, is that our starting point? Because it is, these BMPs have 5 elements. And if we're going to establish BMPs at a high level, maybe the department has, we've got to decide what the elements are for BMPs conceptually. Then we can get into specific techniques related to selectivity, setback trail, or all these different ideas that are put forth in the petitions. But if first we're going to have a Vermont BMP, I think that's where the discussion maybe would start, but maybe not. So that's sort of my question.
But that's a more advanced question than I know the answer.
I was noticing too, Sarah, that the legislative mandate is handed out, looks a lot like the wildlife work that was funded to all of us. And I think, is this the basis of how you wrote the legislation? Or I know you're lawyers who write legislation, but it just seems like there's a lot of things on here that really didn't consider how what trappers already do or what trappers already know. So I was wondering where the language came from.
Sure. So the language, legislative mandate came out of committee discussion. I actually we were working, we were testimony, from lots of people and after running lists and then organize things, but it's a DC like 5 things we would want to address. So I just, setbacks. Where people pointed out how 80% of the long-range road is using the track. So maybe that's just for education to get to the other point. So it was that kind of discussion. Wasn't like this issue. So this.
Tom, do you want me to write your question down? Is it something we need to work on between now and the next meeting to kind of?
Well, maybe, and I don't need to put, direct everything to do, but I'm just trying to understand that. I just want the group's discussion to be more productive and informative towards whatever we collectively reflect on regarding everything. I mean, as I go through here, I could label number 1's a welfare, right? So to me, welfare, based on my work here, is killing animals quickly. Traps that have no mild or moderate injuries for 91% of them. That's where this is, but this is the welfare. And number 3 is the selectivity element. And so just trying to frame what elements we will have, some of which are reflected in the petition, some of which aren't. The practicality part of Atlas BMP relates to size, weight, getting it field, cost, and some of those things, the safety element, there's some safety element, but I just want to have the most productive conversation. So that's why I asked, and I don't think I'm going to make anybody answer it. Number 5 is a dispatch element. There isn't one in the applicant. There's no dispatch element towards BMPs there. So that's a tenet that's sort of undescribed there, but that's not to say that there's something here. That's sort of my official read of it.
Kind of piggyback on what Tom is saying is that I'm looking at the petition process that assuming Fish and Wildlife, where it says that whatever we come up with has to be effectively enforced. So I mean, I guess one of my big issues is just, the enforcement capability. I think Brian mentioned that the BMPs per species. And so, we're not just looking at replacing X trap with Y trap and then everything's going to be better. All dependent upon what animal you're targeting. You're going to use a certain bait, certain location. So how do you enforce and regulate something with so many different nuances?
And to compound on that, it was mentioned that most trappers are trapping are targeting multiple species at once. Okay, so they may be setting traps that can target raccoons, but they're catching, possum at the same time. And the BMPs may not overlap with them. You can't stay one trap.
And I think, I always look at coyotes and bobcats, so thinking about a trappers are targeting coyotes. So if you set a trap for a coyote, and I think the attention might be fairly similar to what you use for a bobcat. And how would a warden in the field know that this is the right trap set for BMP practice for coyote? I mean, that's for someone like Sean Fowler, who is like a, really seasoned trapper. I just think it's just, I thought about this a lot. I just don't see how enforcement is going to be practical. Because there's so many different variables.
There's other metrics that are easier to pay attention to, which is not, they make it a simple device, it's a simple graph, press down. Not that complicated, subjective. But something like, mandating, jaw spread. And if you're concerned about animal welfare or selectivity, then selecting the appropriate size trap for the situation. As long as the season is open, it's not inappropriate to have a trap out that falls into a certain size range, because there are multiple species.
Sure. And that trap set for a coyote that catches a raccoon, that larger trap might really injure that non-target raccoon, but it's not.
There's crossover species. It's not like raccoon traps or just BMP raccoon traps. You have a coyote trap that's also a BMP trap. So there's crossover.
If I recall, there's very few. There's so many variables, that's all I'm saying, and it makes for the public to have expectations. I think it's just, that's kind of what I'm struggling with, but.
I think the whole approach of looking at characteristics of traps, like the trappers, petition makes a little more sense from the point of view of these different traps for weasels, for raccoons, for skunks, and those that are all in the same habitats. It's kind of like I fished today for perch, perch bait, and perch rod, and perch, but I caught a bass. That's the real world. I think of wildlife is that they don't stay in one niche. So I think if we try to do it species by species, we're going to get bogged down. And if we identify characteristics that are desirable, look for I saw here was something about bait. The group size, okay, you want your bait to be covered up, visible from the air. That's going to serve all trapping situations versus saying for raccoon, you have to do exactly this. It's not going to work.
But to that point, I read over ETA's proposals. So I think the non-target issue, I think of non-target, sometimes people just think of all legal and then coyote trap. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the legislature is also concerned with, trapping, if they trapper didn't want to trap a great box or bottom. It's kind of coyote set. I mean, that's also a non-target. So if we just look at 5 items, 6 items here, that's not going to do that much for non-target.
But if you're trapping with 9 towards BMPs, the traps that you're using, if you catch a gray box, coyote trap that's and you do more harvesting, even though if you're tracking coyote, gray boxes until at the same time. If you do more elusive, in theory, the animal welfare and component of this is going to allow you to want animal. It's going to be a stronger environment.
Do it right, if that coyote trap is actually the BMP approved for gray ones.
Oh, you can know that there's a portal, you can just type in 1.5 soft catch enter, and it'll show you right away what sweetest species in the BMP process based on 5. That exists. It's really available. You would have to go through all 22 of these to look for one.
I do agree though that bullet point improvements are easier to apply across the board. For instance, having squiggles on chain on a land set, I don't think there's a lot of opposition to that. It's widely recognized animal welfare tool is still in the chain. Likewise, I don't think there's a lot of opposition to covering the bait, bait and full set. I mean, it's, like, these are fairly, we teach these in track notifications are widely accepted best practices that we've already implemented, already teaching. So to codify that in law or in the BMP next, statewide level is not significantly different. This is a discussion on that.
That being said, I would hate to be punished for catching a skunk. Regular skunk in a box set. Even though there are traps that are with BMPs for skunks, however, on that coil spring double job might not be dead.
Yeah. Well, but this, at least these 6 elements they've listed don't mandate a BMP specific trap per species for it be some sort of situation for any on target. I agree.
I mean, you noticed, are there any legal traps that are suitable for skunks? Because I didn't think that skunks, I don't think there are any legal traps that are suitable. So if you do catch a skunk in another trap, I don't think.
I actually don't know.
Yeah.
There's 22 species, 400 traps.
I don't believe it's.
Yeah.
Here.
So it's 6x6 con, there was a group for skunk and. Not the doctor.
And again, that's where paying attention comes into.
It's also recognizing the fact that they tested 2 football traps. They had enough catches in tracking process to examine 2, only 2 traps, I believe. For skunk, on the exact number. A lot of models out there that have not been tested for skunk limitation research is done.
Yeah, because they weren't prevalently used, so we were going after prevalent species with prevalent trap type. And then if you got close to 20 animals with, for example, skunk, you could then target some skunks and get you to 20, which would then evaluate all those lead processes. And now we have this pass or fail. So there are a number of species like that that don't reach sample size, could in the future then be evaluated, because they're not prevalent. For skunks.
The land trap, I don't know anybody who got TS-85s on land. And these 650 would be 64. That's 6.5 or 64. Most of your number 3 traps are less than 64 or 64. Less. It's less.
Yeah, it's
What if that's more, I'm not sure I'm hearing.
like 6 and 4 ranch, but if the traps are set down way, oh, that's the size, the largest size.
And that is very consistent. The final recommendation for one of the elements that they've listed is a trap appropriately sized for the animal target. That's not spelling out specifically which exact trap you use, which you have to legislate the entire BMP process, but it's saying a guideline of traps that are appropriately sized, right? And no larger than zero.
Yeah, that's one of the most
Basic.
misunderstood things is most traps used in the United States as football traps. 6 inches or slightly bigger. That's the size of a dollar bill in the open position or slightly bigger. And that's sort of across multiple species. If we were in a state that had wolves, Wisconsin or whatever, that would be an undersized trap. But where we are, but that's the commonality of the larger size of football traps.
So for number 4, the location of traps, because we hear from our BMP experts that they're not catching children, they're not catching people, not catching endangered species, all that kind of stuff. It's sort of a red herring to imagine that there's a huge problem with location of traps. And the trappers in the BMP chose the location. It wasn't like there was this group of people who said, can't trap over there, buddy. The trapper chose the location in every case for BMPs. And they weren't catching, the things we worry about most for people like us, never heard of a person being trapped around the trap is the first thing. I've certainly tried myself by accident, but, stuck in the trap when I was paying attention. But, so I think that's a real concern is that, going to dictate location of setting traps, especially when I'm on some class 4 roads. There's a lot of us who drive class 4 roads and we look out our windows and check our traps, for fishers, for example. And, we can fill a trap, see the road, it's 5 feet off the ground, there it is, go on to the next one. So I think that if we start dictating this kind of thing, we're looking to limit opportunity, but also limit outcomes, that people aren't going to be able to get there.
Well, I think probably the trackers testing during the BMP testing process are probably super careful and sensitive as to where they're setting the traps. If they want to catch, dogs or, I mean, I would encourage, looking what other states are doing. Other states have trap setbacks, states that are very trapper friendly. It's not dictating where to set traps, it's just asking trappers to recognize that more and more people are grazing on public lands with their dogs, whether it be on a traffic leash or off leash. And just, giving people the assurance that when they're out there recreating, you don't have to worry. I think that's a pretty small ask.
It's part of trapper education, is trap location. It's a big part of it. But I might have been informed that I will teach that. People learn pretty quickly. And I think nobody would ever want to look for their trap and find out that, the trapper caught the line, he caught a dog or something.
Just as a concern on this as well, legislative mandate does state that we have to address the issue of traffic setbacks. So we're gonna go over this in detail, I'm sure. But defining some of these things is going to be important. What is a public trail? Is a public trail a trail that's on state or federal land, or is a public trail a community trail that crosses private property and is used by the public? But it's open to private grace to private land. What is a public trail?
Private land,